Welcome back to Let's Talk Sports Radio right here on 94.9 Bob FM. Joining me now, the lead fantasy analyst for thescore.com in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Justin Boone. Justin, what a crazy start to the NFL season, yes?
It always is, right? And it's interesting because you start to get some actual data points a week or two into the season. We have all these theories during the offseason, what we think is going to happen. A lot of it's based on what happened last year and stuff. And now a lot of that stuff gets thrown out the window because so much changes year over year. And it's exciting to finally get to see the players on the field, especially when you're talking about rookies getting out there and getting to see them compete for the first time in real games that actually mean something. So it's a very exciting time of year, and I'm happy to be on with you talking about it.
I appreciate it. You know, I don't think any of us thought some of the injuries would hit teams so hard in the first 2 weeks. Ben Roethlisberger out with a very serious elbow injury for the year. You've got Drew Brees, who's out for at least, 2.5, 6 to 8 weeks, 2 months minimum, with a broken bone in his thumb. Ezekiel Elliott finally signs, goes right down to the wire. Last time I talked to you, Antonio Brown was a Raider. Now he's a New England Patriot, at least for now, until whatever happens with him. What has been the biggest? We'll start with the injuries, actually. Of the teams that were hit by injuries, Saints, Pittsburgh, just off the top of my head, there's probably more that I'm missing. Who is the team that is going to be negatively affected the most by the major injuries over the first 2 weeks?
I mean, I think both of those teams are going to be hit pretty hard here. You have to think the Steelers are going to get hit a little worse just because Ben's out for the whole year. But Mason Rudolph's a little bit interesting here. He's kind of an unknown. When he first came into the game last week, struggled a little bit, but kind of settled down as the game went on. Ended up throwing 2 touchdowns to Vance McDonald. So when you're looking at the rest of the guys on that offense now, everybody takes a little bit of a hit. McDonald, though, wasn't really doing that much up to that point in the season, so maybe this is good news for him. Maybe it's a sign of life. Juju Smith-Schuster, he's going to fall down a little bit. Guys like that are always going to get the volume to produce, but you have to knock him down. He's going to be more in that high-end wide receiver 2 range. The interesting thing in this offense to monitor now is going to be the wide receivers behind Juju, because we're seeing a change here. Dante Moncrief, his snaps fell in week 2, and he really face-planted. He had the opportunity. They gave him the shot. He was the veteran, and he did nothing with his chance. He had some injuries, too, in the preseason, so maybe that affected him, but he really struggled to start the year here. So now we're going to see rookie Deontay Johnson get his shot. He told reporters today that the Steelers have let him know that he is going to be the starter moving forward here. So he's somebody in fantasy and deep leagues. You can go out there, throw him on your bench just to see what happens. And then there's also James Washington on the roster. And the reason why Washington's interesting is because he has a history with Mason Rudolph. They were college teammates. We saw the pair connect in the preseason a couple times here, some big catches too. So very interesting. Maybe he could get involved in the offense. But the problem overall is, are they going to be able to sustain a really high volume passing attack with Mason Rudolph under center? Probably not, is unfortunately the answer there. So you're going to end up, still going with guys like Juju and with James Conner. And those other guys are only really stashes at this point until we see what the offense looks like. And then for the Saints, it's hopefully going to be a shorter period of time here. Brees had surgery. We're not really sure on the timetable yet. 6 weeks, 8 weeks. I believe they're bye weeks in week 9. So I would think week 10 is probably the first time that we can really think about him maybe coming back to the lineup. But with him out, it's the same sort of thing. Michael Thomas, still a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2. They're going to pepper him with targets in that offense, so no worries there. Alvin Kamara is going to drop down just a little bit. Mid-running back 1 range. Still going to be in the top 10, though. It's still Alvin Kamara here. The only issue is going to be the scoring opportunities. They're not going to be as abundant with Brees not in that lineup, and that's what really affects all the other guys in the offense. So Latavius Murray loses all his value. We thought he could step into that Mark Ingram role. Well, if Brees isn't there and they're not scoring as much, it's just not as much production to go around, so they're not going to be able to sustain 2 running backs for fantasy. He's really just a handcuff to Kamara. Jared Cook, somebody I really liked going into the season, but now he drops off significantly. He's outside of my top 12 tight ends. And Traquan Smith dealing with an injury, Ted Ginn, both those guys were already boomer bust options. Now they're even bigger boomer bust options, guys you don't want to touch at all in your lineups when Brees isn't there. So not really overly interested in anyone in either offense outside of really the biggest names. And then in that Steelers passing game, I would stash those two guys, Deontay Johnson and James Washington, just to see if one of them can step up.
Good point. I do like the synergy between Mason Rudolph and James Washington. I'm going to put my money on Washington. Really disappointing, though. If you're a guy in redraft and you took Michael Thomas, that's a first overall pick, maybe at the 107, 108 area. That's a huge disappointment. And Jared Cook, I mean, some guys queued him up as a tight end one, so another disappointment. But we'll see. Well, I think Drew Brees has a better a chance of coming back. Let me ask you about some of the guys that have surprised you. I know my guy, again, I'm referring to my dynasty pick, Marquise Brown, has instantly become the wide receiver from Baltimore, has instantly become Lamar Jackson's favorite target. He's put up double-digit fantasy numbers. I know for sure he's one of the guys that's on the rise and surprising you. Who else do you like as a riser and somebody to keep an eye on? You know, waiver wire, redraft, maybe target him in a trade. Who do you like after 2 weeks that wasn't on your radar to begin the season?
Well, let's go with a couple here. We'll try to go through a bunch quick because I know the listeners want this information, right?
Of course, they need it.
Stuff when you're talking about fantasy.
They need it. They need it.
Matt Breida, Raheem Mostert in the 49ers offense. We knew that Breida had value when Jerick McKinnon got hurt, and now Breida stepped up into that sort of 1B role behind Tevin Coleman. Then Tevin Coleman gets hurt. Now we have Breida and Mostert there, both of them producing last week. Breida's an RB2. Mostert's an RB3 flex. I don't know if everyone realizes just how valuable those guys are. That Kyle Shanahan running game produces every single season. It almost doesn't matter who's in that backfield. So both those guys can get into your lineup. When you're looking at receiver, you mentioned Marquise Brown. How about John Brown with the Bills? He was somebody I was very high on going into the season, and we've seen that connection with Josh Allen already, taking advantage of that big arm. But also the big thing for Brown that I kind of didn't expect was the volume that he's getting. I thought that he was going to be that big play threat, but he's also seeing a lot of targets each week. So that's making him a low-end wide receiver, too, for fantasy. Christian Kirk, I was very interested to see what was going to happen with that Cardinals offense, who was going to step up there. Kirk's really been the beneficiary of that high-volume passing attack. Tied for 11th in the league for targets among receivers. He's coming off his first 100-yard game as a pro. I like him a lot as a fringe wide receiver, too, the rest of the way. And there's lots of other guys at receiver that have stepped up. If you want to talk about guys that have really surprised, DK Metcalf, Mecole Hardman, Demarcus Robinson, Mecole Hardman's teammate, Terry McLaurin, John Ross, DJ Shark. One of the things I said about fantasy drafts this year was wide receiver was the position you could wait on because it was just so deep. A lot of these guys weren't even guys that were on my radar. That's how deep this position is this year. I mean, Metcalf's going to be volatile just because that Seahawks offense, they don't throw as much. So, and he's also pretty dependent on the long ball. So somebody that you can get into your lineup as a wide receiver 3, but you got to know he's going to be a little boomer bust for you there. McLaurin's probably the biggest surprise out of anyone, I would say. I liked him coming out, but I didn't think he was going to be able to step in and be a star just based on how he was used in college. We're seeing some of these Ohio State receivers come into the league and have a lot more skills than maybe they were asked to show in college. So it's very interesting to see him go to Washington, step up the first 2 weeks, have really big games there. And that's a team that's going to be trailing a lot. He's really already established himself as their number one receiver the rest of the way. So he's going to see a lot of volume. Really like him. DJ Shark, we saw on Thursday night, he got to play his third game of the season already, but that's 3 straight games where he's producing, has a connection with Gardner Minshew. Want to get him in your lineup. He's still out there in a lot of leagues. Hardman and Robinson are more high-ceiling wide receiver 3s. With Tyreek Hill out, you want to own anyone that's attached to Patrick Mahomes at this point for fantasy, so you want to have both those guys in your lineup. Ross might have an expiration date here when A.J. Green gets back because A.J. Green's going to command a lot of targets. But right now, we don't know when A.J. Green is going to be back at this point. So you're looking at Ross having a tough matchup this week against the Bills. But right now, you can get him in your lineup most weeks as a wide receiver 3. And that offense looks much, much better under new head coach Zach Taylor. And then a couple tight ends we can throw out there too. You talked about the Ravens with Marquise Brown. How about Mark Andrews, the tight end there, gone over 100 yards each of the first 2 weeks. He's into my top 5, was a sleeper candidate before the season, but he's right up there in the top 5 now. And Darren Waller, another guy that had a lot of preseason hype, and he's getting a ton of targets in Oakland. He's going to keep him in the tight end 1 range. And then TJ Hawkinson, I'll mention too, a prospect that was coming in pro ready. We expected he was going to be good. I don't think anyone expected he was going to come out and break the record for yards by a rookie tight end in his debut. But in that Detroit offense, we're talking a lot about high volume passing attacks, low volume passing attacks. Detroit's a team that isn't going to pass as much, and that's why in week 2 we saw Hawkinson kind of fall back to earth a little bit, but still somebody you should be considering, you should be rostering, and maybe putting out there as a low-end tight end 1 every week.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And another guy that we mentioned a few weeks back before the season, before he got injured, Michael Gallup getting a lot of touches as Dak Prescott starts really hot in Dallas. Let's go to some of the disappointments. A few guys, just off the top of my head, I mean, any receiver from the Tennessee Titans comes to mind, just with that offense in kind of a funk. I mean, they came out like crazy offense against to beat the Cleveland Browns. And then I would say maybe some of the skill guys in Tampa Bay are a little disappointing. In general, are there a few guys that you're thinking to yourself, you were high on in the offseason and after the first 2 games, they were disappointing a little bit?
Well, there definitely are. One thing that we have to remember, though, is at this time of year, sometimes it takes a few weeks for these offenses to get it going, to kind of gel, right? Especially when teams have a lot of starters that are sitting out the preseason, and this year we saw a ton of starters sitting out in the preseason. So there are a couple slow starters that I think are going to turn things around, but there's definitely some guys that are struggling and are going to continue to struggle. When you're talking about guys who could turn things around, though, you mentioned Tampa Bay. Jameis Winston, Mike Evans, O.J. Howard. I know people are so upset with those 3. Chris Godwin's been producing. Those 3 have not. The good news here is that they get to play the Giants this week, and that's an excellent matchup from the standpoint of the Giants are near the bottom of the barrel when it comes to getting pressure on the quarterback, near the bottom of the barrel when it comes to coverage downfield. So it's a great get-right spot for that Tampa crew. I'm still holding all those guys, and I'm willing to play all 3 of them. People probably aren't as concerned about Evans just because he's a big star, but I know a lot of people are giving me flack about O.J. Howard, who was somebody that I was very high on before the season. Let's put Howard out there this week, see if he can get it done. If he can't get it done this week, then all right, then it's time to move on from him there. But like I said, there are some fallers that I think are going to continue to struggle that we should be worried about. Devonta Freeman hasn't really looked good this year. A lot of positive reports in the offseason about his health, but he comes out and it really seems like the nagging injuries are catching up to him at this point. He doesn't really have the same burst. It just doesn't seem to be the same player. And I think the Falcons must know that because they have him splitting touches with Ito Smith. He's not getting a big workload. Really hurts his fantasy value. Duke Johnson was someone that people were very excited about when Lamar Miller went down. Not that they were excited about Lamar Miller going down, but for the fantasy aspect of it, really looked like Duke was going to step up there. Then they go and get Carlos Hyde, the veteran. He's come in and taken a big role in that offense, really caps Johnson's upside, makes him a flex play at best, and you're really going to only want to play him in games where it looks like they're going to be trailing, where it looks like it's going to be a lot of points scored. They're going to have to move the ball quite a bit. Otherwise, they're going to be able to rely on Carlos Hyde. Last week, Carlos Hyde had 20 carries. It seems insane that Carlos Hyde has somehow gotten back into the conversation for fantasy, but he has. Basically, everybody in the Dolphins offense, just going off the top of my head here, do not touch that Dolphins offense whatsoever. That team is terrible. They want to be terrible. And specifically, that offensive line is so bad that I just don't think anyone's going to be able to produce there. They've just switched over to Josh Rosen at quarterback. Maybe Rosen will be able to do something, but behind that line, I think we're going to see what happened to him last year in Arizona, which is he's just going to struggle. He's going to have pressure on him all the time there. You talked about the Titans receiving core. Corey Davis, just so bad this season. And I like to normally wait 3 weeks because then you have 3 weeks, I think, gives you a big enough sample size where you can really start to put the picture together. And we have 3 games now with Corey Davis, and he has been bad in all 3 games, whether that's Marcus Mariota's fault, whether that's, Corey Davis not stepping up, whatever the reason is, he cannot be in your lineup. You could drop him moving forward. One that I do not want to admit, but Dante Pettis. I was so high on Pettis, thought he was a breakout candidate this year. He really stepped up late last season, helped people win fantasy titles, but he had a great spring. Then he comes out in the preseason and reports kind of come out that he's struggling a little bit. Maybe the team isn't as high on him as they were during the spring. and then to start the year here, completely flops, 1 target through 2 weeks. Seems like something's missing in his game. And he might be going down that Josh Doxson road where the talent is there, but the killer instinct, that my ball mentality, just doesn't have that. Something's wrong, and at this point, you don't need to keep him on your roster to find out. Jarvis Landry, not a very exciting fantasy option. With Odell Beckham there, Beckham's just soaking up so much work. Landry's not going to get enough targets to be fantasy viable. And then I'll throw a couple tight ends out there as well. Jimmy Graham had a touchdown in week 1. He's on the downside of his career, though. He's injured. He might sit out this week. Apparently, the Packers say that they think he's going to play, but he's someone I don't think you need to have in your lineup at this point. And also Kyle Rudolph, no yards in week 1, 9 yards in week 2. This was a guy that used to be the red zone reindeer, not really getting a lot of work there. Minnesota's gone completely run heavy. The volume isn't there for him. And now Rudolph's also dealing with Irv Smith Jr., who's a young rookie tight end who's working his way into the mix. They play a lot of 2 tight end sets, but the majority of the passing work there goes to Adam Thielen, goes to Stephon Diggs on the outside. So when they do throw, and it's not very often, and that's likely going to be the case this week because this week they're at home as big favorites against the Raiders. That's another spot where they're going to be able to just run the ball. So I would not have Rudolph anywhere near my lineup.
What about staying with San Fran? What about George Kittle? This guy set the yardage record last year for tight ends. This year, he's putting up single digits. I think anybody that drafted George Kittle, I know I have him in some of my lineups, is a little bit disappointed, especially when there's other tight ends who you could have got lower. Mark Andrews, Darren Waller. George Kittle's been a little bit of a disappointment, and there's no evidence to show that the ball is going to get funneled towards him. I know in the first game of the year, he had a touchdown called back, or 2 touchdowns, I believe, called back. But what's going on with George Kittle?
With Kittle is another player that I'm not that worried about, just because when you're talking about a player that's that talented, that's that big of a part of the offense, and an offensive mind like Kyle Shanahan, he is going to find ways to get Kittle the ball. And that's one of those situations where you need the bigger sample size, right? So at any point during the season, you could have a couple bad games. And like you said with Kittle, he was very close to a big game in week 1, and the penalties went against him there. So let's get a bigger sample size there, but I'm not worried about Kittle at all. He's going to finish in the top 3 tight ends in fantasy this year.
All right, let's take a look at your article today, which you can find on thescore.com. Start, sit, stash, quit. Now, we already, this is for week 3. We already went over a few of these guys, but I just want to touch on a few more. You like this week to start Josh Allen, Buffalo quarterback for the Bengals. I'm sure there's no bias behind that. And David Montgomery at Washington. We'll start with Montgomery. He had a slow start. He was on Thursday Night Football, but he came back last week. You project him this week to rush for 82 yards, a touchdown, 11 receiving at Washington, who has kind of been bleeding on defense this year. I think that's a pretty safe bet. You like Dave Montgomery this week.
Yeah, and I think it's just about his usage. It's about the rookie learning curve, and about as the season going along. A rookie back starting to get more work. And we saw that from week 1 to week 2. His snaps went up a little bit. His touches went up big time. He had 6 carries in week 1. He had 18 carries in week 2. Still didn't have a huge game there, but that was also, going against an opponent like the Broncos, a little tougher. Not going to face that tough of a front in Washington as far as the run defense there goes. And the Bears are big favorites on the road here in this game. I think there's a good chance this could be the breakout performance that everybody wants to see from Montgomery. And great news for him, it's going to happen in prime time there.
Nice. And then let's touch a little bit on Josh Allen. You get a statistic from Establish the Runs, Adam Levitan, where he said week 12 last week, fantasy points per game. Josh Allen, it trails just Deshaun Watson and Patrick Mahomes of average points per game at 23.2. You like the Bills quarterback Josh Allen versus the Bengals at home this week.
Yeah, and he's been a player who I think I mentioned him in this column every single week this year so far. And part of it is I'm going to probably have to stop that soon because he's going to be so high owned that he's just going to be a fantasy starter at this point, not someone who's going to be a starter sit option. But with that rushing floor that he has, it puts him in the conversation every week. And last week, had a nice matchup against the Giants. This week, the home opener for the Bills, they're going to be fired up going against the Bengals there. And yeah, that stat I thought was so important because I thought it would be surprising for people. During the offseason, I mentioned so many times that Josh Allen was the number one fantasy quarterback over the last 6 weeks last year, just because it's shocking to think of when you have all these big names at quarterback that somebody like Josh Allen, who took a lot of flack in the media, a lot of flack from the fans, was able to produce in fantasy. And it just goes back to that rushing floor. So yeah, when you look at over those last 6 games last year and now the start to this season, the fact that he's almost equal to Deshaun Watson in fantasy points per game, it's so surprising to see that stat. And when I saw that tweet, even I was stunned at that. So I think that's important to remember, and it's just because of that rushing floor. It's going to be a roller coaster when you own Josh Allen and when you start him. He's going to make some boneheaded plays. He's going to throw some very strange passes that get intercepted, but he's also going to run the ball a bunch. And every 40 rushing yards he gets is like another passing touchdown. And he also, with not a very strong running game there, he's so involved around the goal line as well when we're talking about running the ball. So he's a player that at this point, I think he should be owned everywhere because I think he should be a low-end fantasy starter.
All right, let's finish off on this. You are out on Kirk Cousins versus the Raiders at home. Interesting start to the season for Minnesota. You know, looks like Dalvin Cook's healthy and he looks strong. 111 yards to open the season and then 154 yards. He's got 3 touchdowns already. Looks like the Vikings are going towards a run-based offense, but that's not good for people that want to start Kirk Cousins, even in real-life football, not even fantasy. You know, last week, Cousins throws 2 picks versus the Packers. The week previous to that, he only threw 98 yards. You know, if you're in Minnesota as an owner, as a franchise, you know, $84 million guaranteed. Cousins isn't getting the job done, but at least in the fantasy perspective, looks like if you drafted Dalvin Cook, you're getting good, strong returns as a high-end RB1. What's going on with Cousins, and what do you think of the Minnesota offense? We'll finish on that.
Well, I kind of mentioned it when we talked about Kyle Rudolph there, about the run-heavy approach. I think with Cousins, it's a tale of 2 games. It's 2 really different reasons why he played poorly. In week 1, it wasn't totally his fault. They just steamrolled the Falcons in that game, and he didn't have to throw. He had 10 attempts in that game total, which is an insanely low number. We still saw someone like Adam Thielen manage to catch a touchdown in that one and salvage his fantasy day. But for Cousins, unless he throws a couple touchdowns, when the volume is so low like that, he's just not going to be able to produce for fantasy. And I'm kind of projecting that to happen here. What happened in week 2 for him, he went up against the Packers defense that's a lot better than people realize. When we're talking about surprises to start the year, that Packers defense is much improved. They brought in a few different pieces. They got a little swagger to them now. And it was a tough game. That's going to be a tough matchup for any quarterback. And now this week, going against the Raiders, he's back at home. He's a big favorite. They're going to be able to just run the ball down the Raiders' throats here. And I don't think that he's going to have to pass very much. I think he's going to be under 20 pass attempts in the game. So like I said, there is still a path for him to be productive for fantasy, but it's going to require him to throw, 2 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns with such limited volume. And it's possible, but I think it's unlikely. And I think that the stats this week are going to go towards Dalvin Cook, towards Alexander Madison. We're going to see that rushing game get it done against the Raiders.
All right, good stuff. That's Justin Boone, lead fantasy analyst for thescore.com out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Justin, I know your Bills beat my beloved Jets. We blew a 16-point lead, but we'll face off again soon right here on Let's Talk Sports Radio, and then the Jets and the Bills will play again in December, so we'll have to catch up after that. Sound good?
For sure, and hopefully the Jets will be a little healthier at that point.
I don't know what's going on with Sam Darnold. He's enjoying the New York life. He's got mono. I don't know what happens there, but you want to talk about fantasy. I know we're wrapping up, but I don't know what's going on with the Jets. If it's Le'Veon Bell and nobody else, you know what I'm saying? So, I'll let you chime in on that.
It kind of is. The only thing I'm worried about with Bell is he's getting so much volume that I'm worried he's going to get hurt. We already saw he went for an MRI on his shoulder last week before the game. Turned out he was fine. He was able to play. Just getting a lot of volume. He's all there is on that offense right now. So I think there's a chance we're going to see Bell maybe break down at some point this season, just under that kind of workload. But hopefully that's not the case. the other thing that's very exciting about the Jets is in the second half of the year, the schedule gets much, much easier for them. They get the Dolphins twice. I think they have Washington, some other teams in there. So after around week 8, I believe, schedule really cleans up. So I would be looking at Sam Darnold once he's back in the lineup. Chris Herndon, who's out on suspension right now, he's going to be back. Robbie Anderson and Bell. I think those guys are going to help people get to the fantasy playoffs in the second half of the year and maybe win some fantasy titles if they can all stay healthy.
All right, so we're not playing for the top 5 draft pick just yet. We're holding out hope. Maybe we'll have a wild card. Who knows? It's been a wild season.
You're definitely not going to finish ahead of the Bills, though, unfortunately.
No, definitely. You know what? Bills look good, man. Devin Singletary, even though he's got a little bit of a hamstring, like you said, John Brown, Josh Allen. It's been a good start for the Bills so far, but, that's how many Bills seasons start, so.
It's very true.
All right, that's Justin Boone, lead fantasy analyst for thescore.com. More Let's Talk Sports Radio right here on 94.9 Bob FM. Stick around. For now.